Hi everybody, this is Grandma Donna. I'm making this for my family and I'm kind of nervous, but I'm excited to tell you about the first 20 years of my life. My name is Donna Jean Anderson Bledsoe, and I was born in Salt Lake City, Utah on September 30th, 1935, and I had black hair when I was born, if you can imagine. My parents are Grant Larson Anderson and Marjorie Bernice Simons, and they were wonderful parents. I want to tell you a little bit about them. When Dad was in the Navy, he was stationed in the Marianas Islands, and the Japanese bombed their base every night. And it was pretty terrifying for him because when he came back home from the war, he had terrible nightmares for a long time, and he never wanted to talk about being in the Navy. His job over there was, as a CB, was to drive a great big bulldozer, and they made the airfields for the military base. He was raised in Ogden and then in California. But he went to high school in Salt Lake City. And when he was in high school, he loved music and he played the drums and the xylophone. And he loved to hear the military marches of John Philip Sousa. He was very patriotic. He was a great, kind man. And when he would hear those beautiful and fun military marches, he would always tear up, and because he loved our country so much. Dad was a butcher, and he went to work for his Uncle Stephen when he was a young adult, before he joined the war. And now I'd like to tell you a little bit about my mom. My mom was raised in Salt Lake and also raised in Long Beach, California. And I think when she went to high school in Salt Lake City also, she said when they were all young, her dad would take her and her brothers and sisters to the beach every day before school. So they loved to swim. She loved math, and so she really enjoyed math, and that was not my best subject. I was always into the English and writing and things like that. My dad loved to work in our yard when we moved to Long Beach, and he always, every year, he would plant sweet peas, and they were the best smelling, beautiful flower. He also planted rhubarb, and so our family had a lot of really great rhubarb pies. My mom was a beautiful, loving woman, and she could do anything she put her mind to. One year, she actually, when we were living in Long Beach, she painted our entire living room and reupholstered all the furniture just so that she could make our house beautiful for my Grandma Anderson's 80th birthday party. And also, when I was at seminary, they started seminary in Long Beach when I was in my senior year. So before then, I didn't get to go. But when I went to seminary, my mother would get my brothers and sisters up in the morning, and around the kitchen table, she would teach them about the Book of Mormon. And they each made books for themselves with all the pictures of the prophets, and they learned about the people and the prophets in the Book of Mormon. And this was her most precious knowledge, and she shared it with them, and they were able to get their own testimonies of the gospel. And my mom made marvelous pies. And we used to get milk in quart cartons. So my brothers would come home from school and they would drink a quart of milk and have a half of a pie. And my mom also made most of my clothes. At one point, my grandpa and Grandma Anderson bought a turkey farm up in West Arcadia, California. And this turkey farm had a whole bunch of turkey, chicken and turkey coops, and they were pretty big. And when we would go up there for Thanksgiving or to visit, we'd clean out those turkey coops and play house in them. And our cousins were there, Jeanette and David and Mary. When my grandpa and grandma had their turkey ranch, they got a lot of turkey feed in these cotton sacks. And actually, they were made out of really good, pretty neat material. So most of my play clothes and darls were made out of these feed sacks. My mom was a great seamstress. In fact, she even made my wedding dress. She made my clothes. My mom was always totally active in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. She was in a lot of primary callings and Relief Society mainly. My brothers and sisters are Grant Larson Anderson, who was born in 1938, 3 years after me, and my beautiful sister Darl, Marjorie Darl, was born 5 years later in 1940. Our little brother Kenny was born on Pearl Harbor Day in December 7th, 1941. I remember that day because it was kind of scary. The war had just broken out and we had to go stay with our Aunt Noni and our Uncle Al while my mom was in the hospital. And everything was a blackout at our house. That meant you didn't have any lights on at all. Our next brother, Carl D. Anderson, was born in 1948. And then Keith Larson Anderson was born a few years later, and Marilyn Carol Anderson, my baby sister, was born when I was 17 years old. And we all were thrilled to have such a darling baby sister. When I was 5 years old, my family moved to San Pedro, California, and we lived on MacArthur Street. And it was during the war. No, it was just before the war. My Aunt Elaine came to live across the street in a little house from us during the war. And everybody helped with the war effort. Everybody served in the war. My dad joined the Navy and he was in the Seabees. And my mom and my Aunt Elaine went to work at the Long Beach Naval Shipyard. And they worked different shifts, so they kind of traded babysitting because Aunt Elaine had my little cousin Karen. My mom was a welder at the shipyard, and my Aunt Elaine was a secretary. So everybody pitched in during the war. And sometimes we had to have babysitters. I remember one babysitter, she was a middle-aged woman, and one day she was asking my little brother Grant to say grace. So he said, Grace. And so she said, say grace. And he said, Grace. And she became very upset. And she didn't realize that she should have just asked him to say the blessing on the food. And during the war, just when Kenny was born, my mom was heating up a bottle for him during the night. And we had all this black paper on our windows so that if planes were flying overhead, they couldn't see any light. And there were men in our neighborhood who volunteered to be air raid wardens, and they would walk around the neighborhood at night. And one time she was heating up a bottle for Kenny, and this man yelled, turn off that blankety blank light. Anyway, the war was a hard time for everybody. Our food was rationed, and you had coupon books, so depending on how many people you had in your family would depend on how much flour or sugar or food you could, eggs, things like that you could get to feed your family. You had to get it from the market with coupons. And we had margarine, and it came in a cellophane bag that had a little orange pouch in it, and you had to pinch the pouch with your fingers, and that would release the food coloring. So then you had to knead this cellophane pouch with your hands, and then eventually the margarine became yellow, so it looked like butter. But everyone was helping with the war effort. So another babysitter we had was like a teenage girl, and she came into our house and she got out all the butcher knives that we had and she started playing with them. And so my parents never called, or my mom never called her back to babysit. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my grandparents. My grandparents were George and Mary Simons, and they were just wonderful grandparents. This is my mother's parents. They lived in Salt Lake City, and Grandpa Simons was a successful salesman. But about the time we moved to San Pedro, they moved to San Pedro also. When Grandpa Simons was only 17 years old, he served a mission in Africa, and he had to go to Africa on the boat all by himself. He had memorized 900 scriptures, and later, when he was in the San Pedro ward, he was in the bishopric, and I remember him giving some pretty strong, fiery talks in the San Pedro ward. And later, he went on to become the patriarch of the stake in that area, and he gave over 1,000 patriarchal blessings. Grandma Simons, Mary, was a beautiful, sweet, kind woman, and she was always positive, no matter what was happening at their house. If you ask her how she was, she would always say, wonderful or great. And she did a lot of stuff. She was always active in the Stake Relief Society and in the ward. And they were apartment managers when they moved to San Pedro, as well as Grandpa was a salesman. And her landlord would always bring her these gigantic tuna fish. They were this big, and she would cut them up and cook them, and then she would can them. She had a big canning machine and a big pressure cooker, and she would actually can them in cans. And after many years, they moved to Harbor City, California. But their children were all in Southern California, and we all got together with our aunts and uncles a lot. We had a lot of family times. Their children were Aunt Ruth and Uncle Rawl, Aunt Noni and Uncle Al, Aunt Grace and Uncle Rod, and Uncle George and Aunt Phyllis, and Aunt Elaine and Uncle Lee. And then during the war, Aunt Elaine and Uncle Lee divorced, and she married Jack Parker, and that lasted forever. And my dad's dad was Edward H. Anderson II. He was a certified public accountant, and he was also the bishop of the Long Beach First Ward, the first time it was organized. And he was set apart by the prophet President David O. McKay. I remember he baptized me when I was 8 years old because my dad was away at war. Lilith Larson Anderson was my grandma, and she was a lovely, kind woman. And she served in a lot of stake and ward callings, mainly, I think, in the primary and the Relief Society. And she was a marvelous cook. She was a gourmet cook. When she became a widow, she moved to Long Beach, and because they had been living on this turkey ranch in West Arcadia. But she wanted to be closer to my family, so she moved to Long Beach, and Jeanette and I would visit her in her apartment. Jeanette was my cousin that was closest to my age, and we spent lots of time together growing up. Grandma Anderson loved to watch baseball games on television, and she, when I was in high school, she took me on a trip to Henderson, Nevada, to visit our cousins, Jeanette and David and Mary and Aunt Marge, when they were living there. And we went by train, and when we got off the train, we went into a casino to go to the bathroom, and they promptly escorted us out as soon as we got in the front door, because in those days, which was a long time ago, they did not let children in under the age of 18. But she took me to Henderson, and we had a really great visit. She also, when I was in high school, would take me to Long Beach symphony concerts, and I developed a great love for classical music. Their children were Edward H. Anderson III, my Uncle Ed, who he was married to Aunt Dot, and he died 6 months after their marriage with an infected tooth. It was so different in those days. They just didn't have the medical knowledge that they do nowadays. Uncle Lloyd and Aunt Marge, and then my dad, Grant Larson, and Aunt Molly Julia. During the war years, when we were in San Pedro, the polio epidemic broke out, and the neighbors on both sides of us got polio, and one of our neighbors died, and the other one was in an iron lung at their house. It was so sad. And in those days, instead of having a mortuary hold the body, they would put the body in the casket in your living room, and people came to pay their respects when the people were home until the funeral. And in those days, things are a lot different. They had wringer washers, and that's where, when you wanted to wring out your clothes, they didn't have electric washers. You'd feed like a sheet through a wringer, and one time my arm went right through the wringer. And fortunately, they had a lever on the side of the washer that you could just pull it up, and it released whatever was in there. So I got my arm back. But in those days, I attended Bandini Street School for my elementary school when I was first in San Pedro, and I loved that school. It was so fun. They had on May Day, and it was way in the olden days, they had a maypole where they had these streamers hanging down from a pole, and you danced all around it. And I was in a lot of plays in that school. My mom made me a Martha Washington dress because she was such a good seamstress. And they taught us a lot of Spanish when I was in Bandini Street School. This was in the first grade. And also we learned Spanish dances. But in the second grade, because of the war, I had to go to Barton Hill School. Barton Hill was just a little bit closer, but it wasn't necessarily a better school. And I had left my 3 best friends from the first grade at Bandini Street School. We call ourselves a 4-leaf clover club. It was Barbara Karn Larson, Suzanne Amar, and me, and we had a lot of fun together. But anyway, at Barton Hill School, there was a gully that was behind Barton Hill. You could walk down it and walk back up it to get to the school a little bit quicker. So one day I was coming home from Barton Hill, and I decided to take the gully route. And I went down to the bottom, and then coming up the back, this rabid dog just started following me and barking at me. I was terrified, and he didn't bite me, but he left his slobber all over the back of my leg. And I was so thankful to get away from there. I never went that way again. And on the way to Barton Hill School, you had to cross the Gaffey Bridge in San Pedro, and then turn left and go down to Barton Hill. And on the way, there was this house where this lady lived that we called the Witch. She wore these long, dark clothes, and she looked like a witch, and we always called her the Witch. Well, one day, she came to my mom's house. She came to our house. And during the war, we had so many people come to our house asking for food. My mother would always give everybody the same thing, of an egg sandwich. And she never turned anyone away, but there were a lot of times when people would come, knock on our door and ask for food. But during the Barton Hill years, they did have some interesting classes during the summer. They had dance classes and art classes and a lot of activity classes. But was so happy when in the 3rd grade I got to go back to Vandini Street School, because it was there that I was reunited with my friends, my girlfriends, and during that time I really loved to play with paper dolls. They had the most beautiful paper dolls. You could cut them out. They had, and a lot of them were of movie stars. They had gorgeous clothes, and I had so much fun playing with those paper dolls. My sister Dora and I were terrified of dogs. We didn't have a dog, but dogs would just run loose in those days, and sometimes we'd be out walking and they'd bark at us, and we would just hold on to each other. And we were also afraid of spiders, just the same way. But Dora loved kittens. One day she took her doll buggy and she went up the street, and she came home with a whole doll buggy full of baby kittens. And my mom did let her keep one of them. The last time I saw one of my friends from the 4-Leaf Clover Club was when I had 5 children, and Suzanne Amar was in college still. But anyway, those were treasured friends. When I was in the 3rd and 4th and 5th grade, we were still all friends, really close friends, and they would take horseback riding lessons on Saturdays, and occasionally they would invite me to go with them. And so that was pretty thrilling. And during those times, I really loved riding my bike and roller skating. But when I was about 10 years old, I decided the one thing I wanted for Christmas was a horse, and I didn't want anything else. So I had no clue what it would mean to own a horse. We didn't live in an area where you could even own a horse, let alone the expense or what it would require to keep a horse. But that was all I wanted for Christmas. So on Christmas morning, we opened up all of our gifts, and then my dad came in the living room with a big bowl of oats, and he said, "Oh, let's go back out in the back and see the horse." So we went out in the backyard, and there was this little tiny, about 8 inches tall toy horse. And I was so disappointed. And my dad, who had a great sense of humor, he thought that was really hilarious. But anyway, I did get a lot of really nice presents that year, but it wasn't a horse. During the war years, my siblings and I, we used to go to the movies at the local theater. And in those days, they just showed serials like Hopalong Cassidy or The Lone Ranger or something like that. And they would give away prizes at every movie showing on Saturdays. And one time our family won goldfish, and another time we won a puppy. But anyway, it was pretty fun. Sometime in the 1940s, my grandma and grandpa Anderson bought a turkey ranch in West Arcadia. It was a pretty big place. It was a big house, and when my dad would come home on leave from the Navy, we would all jump into the car on a Sunday and go up and visit them. They had all these big turkey and chicken coops where you could sweep them out and play house in them. And they had this garage where they had a big vat where you could put boiling water and put the turkeys in so you could remove all their feathers. And then they had a big, gigantic roll of cellophane where they could wrap them up after they processed them ready to sell. On Thanksgiving, we would make Indian headbands and would put turkey feathers in them. And their next door neighbor, interestingly enough, was a bookie for the Santa Anita racetrack in Arcadia. And you know, a bookie is a guy who takes the bets for the races. In the early days, we actually curled our hair with strips of cotton. Our parents would tear up strips of sheeting and then would roll our hair around these sheets and tie them in bows, and they made really beautiful ringlets in our hair. And then we also had a curling iron, but you heated it on the stove. And we had telephones that hung on the wall, and several people's numbers were on the same line, so that we had a party line, they called it. And it was like 2 rings for my family, 3 rings for our neighbors. So you're only supposed to answer it when it's the ring for your family. But if somebody wanted to hear what you were going to say on your telephone conversation, they would just pick up the phone and they could hear everything you were saying on your call. Pretty different from nowadays. When I was in the 5th grade, I had a teacher named Mr. Fish. And for whatever reason, Mr. Fish did not like me. And he would single me out in front of the class every single day and tell me I was going to be a failure and that I not going to pass the test so that I could take algebra in junior high school. And I didn't pass the test, and I wasn't able to take algebra. And of course, all my best friends were in different classes than I was when I went to junior high school. My first experience at junior high school was really hard, and it was really difficult for me. My mother could see that I was struggling, so she went to the school and somehow they put me in some better classes, but I was still not with my 3 best friends, although we did get together a lot still during the junior high school years. I went to Richard Henry Dana Junior High School in San Pedro, and I did have a lot of fun in those years. I loved my classes mostly, and I made a lot of new friends. One year during junior high school, our cousins David and Jeanette and Mary came to live with us. They were Lloyd and Marge's children. And we lived on Elberon Street. We had 2 sets we just had a set of bunk beds, but Jeanette slept on one end, I slept on the other end in the top bunk, and David and Grant slept in the lower bunk on either end. And we had a hard time going to sleep because we would all just be talking and talking. And in the other room, our little cousin Mary slept with Darrell. And we really loved our cousins. We spent a lot of time growing up with them. And in San Pedro Ward, we did have a really good beehive group. It was a really good group of girls. There was probably 10 or 12 of us. And I wanted to go to a stake girls activity, which would have been in Long Beach. And I was 11 years old, but someone in our family had measles or mumps, and in those days they quarantined your house. You couldn't go in or out of your house for like 2 weeks until they were better. So I had to go to Grandma Simon's house so that I could go to school. But I was so lonesome for my brother Carl that I just needed to see him. So my grandparents took me to my house. My mom brought Carl out into the front yard to the fence, and I gave him a kiss and a hug, and I was so excited to see him. But I didn't get to go to the stake activity because of the quarantine. Because everybody was quarantined in those days, and we were quarantined a lot. I took piano lessons during junior high school from a lady in our ward named Alta Lewis. And I remember going to her house, and she had 3 beautiful daughters, and she had their pictures up on her wall, and I thought they were so beautiful. Occasionally, I would play a solo in sacrament meeting in San Pedro Ward. And one time I announced that I was going to play Chopin's Minute Waltz in 3 minutes. Anyway, it was pretty funny. And I taught a primary class when I was 11 years old. I taught the Sunbeams, they were 3 years old. San Pedro Ward at that time met in a huge house. It was before the chapel was built. And there was several rooms built up on the top of the garage of that San Pedro Ward house. And my primary class was in a little room that was above that garage. Sometimes after junior high school, I would walk down to my grandma Simon's apartment building where they were the managers, and my aunts would be there with their children, and we'd just all sit around and watch them or listen to them talk, and it was a lot of fun. And Grandma would always send us to the bakery that was about a block away, and she'd give us money to buy a treat for everybody. And sometimes all of us would just walk downtown and go window shopping. Had a big long walk together, and that was really fun. Also in junior high school, my brother Grant and I would go to Cabrillo Beach in San Pedro during the summer, and would always get a treat. My treat every time was an Abba Zaba bar. But when I was in the 8th grade, just before we moved to Long Beach, I remember waiting for the bus to go home after we'd been at the beach, and my friends gave me a cigarette. And I remember feeling a tangible magnetic pull with that cigarette. So I put it in my pocket because I didn't know what to do with it. And I was very shy, and anyway, I later threw it away. And I had another experience like that one time when I was in Las Vegas. We went into a casino and somebody gave me a roll of nickels to put in the slot machines, and I felt that same magnetic pull. Anyway, fortunately, I didn't become a gambler nor a smoker, so I guess that was lucky. I'm going to just tell a little tiny bit about my Long Beach years and high school. Oh, I have to tell one thing about junior high school. I became a drama queen in junior high school because everything in my life seemed to be like my life would be over with just the littlest thing happening. One time I went to a school dance at the YMCA with our class, and my dad marched in there at 10 o'clock at night and pulled me out of there in front of all my friends, and I actually thought my life was going to be over. But anyway, many times he protected me from lots of things, and at that time some of my friends were getting into drinking and partying, and I'm sure I was protected. A little bit about high school and a little bit when we were in Long Beach. I remember Keith was about 18 months old when we moved to Long Beach, and it seemed like he got sick with these high fevers, and we'd have to put him in the kitchen sink, and we bathed him in lukewarm water to get rid of his fevers. But it was so scary because he would have convulsions, and it was really scary. We had a really good MyMaid class. I was in the 9th grade, and we had about 10 girls, and we had a lot of fun together. And there was a great group of girls in our ward. One time we had a sleepover at Nancy Allen's home. Nancy is the first person I met at girls' camp in Long Beach First Ward, and she's been my friend forever. Anyway, we had a sleepover at her house, and Kay Parkin, who has always been one of my very closest friends, we thought we were so smart, so we stayed up all night. And then the whole group went to the beach the next day down in Long Beach, and we fell asleep on the beach, and we both had blisters on the back of our legs that were so filled with water and so painful we couldn't go to school for many days. I have to tell about my dad. My dad worked at Pacific Meats, and he'd get up about 4:30 in the morning and go to work, and he made the orders for all the ships in the harbor and outfitted them for all the provision they would need for their next trip out to sea for several months. He used to bring home a lot of different kind of meats. And anyway, one day he brought home a cow tongue. So my mother boiled it in onions and salt and pepper, and then they peeled it and they made it into sandwiches. So I took a tongue sandwich to school in my school lunch. And when you look at the tongue, it's not so bad, but when you see those 3 holes in it where the veins went through, that was that was so gross. I couldn't eat it. And the other thing, he tried to get me to eat oysters, but I just couldn't do it. They were just too slimy. It was really fun in high school. We had a great group of young adults. And we got to dress up a lot in those days. Girls wore hats and gloves, and we just dressed really fancy. And we had a lot of really neat dances in those days. We all knew how to do the waltz and the foxtrot and the Lindy and even the jitterbug. And it was during the 50s, and great music, great dances. We got to wear formals a lot. We had corsages that our dates would bring us, but I was very, very shy. And even through high school, my eyes would swell shut if I went to a dance and I was in unfamiliar territory. I was very shy. But when I was 16 years old in high school, I got a job, and I was working for Bill and Elaine Rogers. They had the newspaper franchise for San Pedro, Wilmington, and Long Beach, and I did the billing for for all the customers. And they were very kind to me. So one time, Kay Parkin and I went to a stake basketball game, and Kay saw a boy she wanted to meet, and she was very outgoing and very gregarious. And so she took the referee note that gave her phone number on it and asked her to give it to Bob Speakman. And asked him to call her. So Bob called her, and she said, and he agreed to come down to her house. And so she said, "Bring your blonde friend. My friend thinks he's cute." So that's the night, or the Monday night following was the night I met Bob Bledsoe. They came down, and I was working at the Rogers house, and so Bill Rogers took me over to Kay's house after that, and the boys were already there, and they talked about themselves for a while, and I played the piano. And anyway, Bob or I neither could sleep that whole night, and we dated after that all through high school for the rest of our junior and senior year. And 2 nights after we met, we were up on a front porch. He kissed me on the cheek and told me he was going to marry me. We had a lot of fun dances, and one time I remember, we went to a lot of really fun firesides and activities with our ward group. One time we were taking a sailor home to Terminal Island because a lot of sailors attended our ward, and they were young, and we had a fireside meeting that night, and we saw this sailor stumbling along the road on the way back to the base, and I thought he was drunk. And Bob said, "No, we need to go pick him up." So we picked him up, and he was so grateful. He had missed a bus, and he was so exhausted. And he was so grateful that we had picked him up, and I was so grateful that Bob was in tune to pick him up. In my junior and senior year in high school, I took a secretarial course, and I learned typing and shorthand, and I did pretty well at it, and I was able to test out at 140 words for shorthand per minute and 120 for typing. And I was offered a job by the Long Beach Naval Shipyard after I got out of school. But in the meantime, I became engaged to Bob. I was also offered a scholarship to BYU, but my parents weren't excited about that because in their experience, every girl they knew that had gone to college was conceited and didn't want to have a family. So they were not excited about it. But anyway, in September, I went to work at the Long Beach Naval Shipyard, and Bob was going to school and working full time, and I didn't see hardly anything of him. So it was kind of hard. But I also took a course like in home nursing at high school. And then when Bob got really sick after he was older, that came in a lot, really handy, because I had learned how to do pretty much all the things that a certified nursing assistant does. But anyway, during this time when I was working at the shipyard, I think it was around Christmas, Kay encouraged me to take my scholarship with BYU. And so since I wasn't hardly seeing Bob at all and he was really busy, I broke our engagement. I went to BYU for 1 semester, but Kay was engaged to Dee by then, and he was running for student body president. And they had so many things going on. I practically never saw her. And so and our roommates had totally different standards. So I was kind of like a fish out of water. So at Easter time, I came home and I got engaged to Bob again, and then we were married in September. And I have to tell you a little bit about our marriage. Our marriage trip was kind of memorable because the night of our marriage, we were married in the St. George Temple on September 7th, 1954. And Bob had tons of relatives up in Vail, which is about 18 miles above St. George. So they put on a reception for us that night. And his uncles, they were all cowboys. They kidnapped me and put me in their truck, and they were doing a chivalry on me. They were gonna take me out in the boonies and leave me there. And here I was, this 18-year-old shy girl who didn't know them practically or anybody else, and I was terrified. But Bob found out about it, and he came to rescue me in the truck, and he got his hand slammed in the door of the truck. But anyway, he managed to rescue me. So we went on our honeymoon to Zion, and in those days the streets weren't marked very well. So we ended up in Cedar City, but we spent the next few days in Zion, and on our way home, then we went back to Vail and changed cars with Bob's parents. And then on the way home, we heard this terrible noise in our car. We were just outside of Victorville, and Bob looked under the car, and there was oil just pouring out everywhere. So this highway patrolman came by and took us into Victorville, and the next day Bob's father came and he towed us home to California in our car. Anyway, that was the start of 65 years of many ups and downs adventures. Anyway, my family, I just have to tell you, my mom said she always had a testimony of the gospel. Well, I didn't. I was always active, and I believed the church was true, but it was when I was 23 years old and I was attending a primary meeting that I learned, and I got my testimony of one lady told how she knew she had a Heavenly Father who loved her, and she was looking forward to meeting someday. And I thought to myself, I wish I could know that. So that very night I went home, I started praying for that knowledge, and eventually I did get that knowledge. And I know I have a Heavenly Father who loves me, and He loves every one of us. We all have a Heavenly Father who knows us by name. He knows every one of us, and He wants to bless us, and we can receive answers to our prayers. And I love each one of you so much. You will never know how much I love you and treasure you. I'm so thankful for you. And I say this in the name of Jesus Christ, amen.